folks. Hey, Bill. By the way, my name is Keelan Evanini. I'm the president of the Jefferson Educational Society, for those who I don't know. And I've been here 26 years in Erie, and you wouldn't believe how many times people have asked me, is it me, or do you have an accent? I had no idea. Turns out, it's you. Right? This is a very appropriate language because I don't hear my own accent. I just hear y'all's. Anyways, welcome to another partnered event with the Hagen History Center and our Historical Society. It's been a wonderfully successful series. I think we're going into year 2, and there's more to come. I'm here just to say a couple of things. If you love history, then you'll love being here at the Jefferson, July 7th through 11th. We have Colgate University Distinguished Historian here in Erie, Pennsylvania, and he's going to do 6 talks on the most important dates in human history. So it's going to be really, really nice. We'll be here for a whole week. If you're a historian, don't miss that. And for the Q&A, you should have gotten an index card by the door. If you didn't and need one, raise your hand, somebody will bring you one. Please keep your questions short and write clearly so that Cal can ask them the way they are meant to ask. So without further ado, please welcome to the stage the Executive Director of the Hagen History Center, Cal Pfeiffer.
Thanks, Berkey, and a big thank you to the whole staff at the Jefferson. As Berkey said, this has been a wonderful partnership between our 2 organizations. It is our 2nd year, and we're working on our programming for year 3 for this quarterly lecture series. I've been looking forward to tonight for close to a year in terms of having our speaker here, but this particular topic goes back a lot longer than that, and I'll tell you the story in a little bit. But our speaker, Dr. Keelan Evanini, is joining us this evening from New Jersey, but he has deep Erie ties. In fact, the front row over here is the family. They're having a family reunion tomorrow. So all of these years of coming to Erie got him interested in the Erie accent. As a matter of fact, after attending undergrad at UC Berkeley, Keelan went on to the University of Pennsylvania, where he specifically studied the Erie accent and wrote his dissertation on it. So here's the quick story part that sort of connected me with the speaker and the topic. And this goes back to one of Erie's most wonderful cultural and culinary destinations, Sontheimer's Bakery. So I had just recently returned professionally to Erie after living away, and I'm standing in line at Sontheimer's, waiting to get my custard Danish that I've purchased since I was a little kid. And I realized everybody in line in front of me, and I would say they're approximately sort of 80-ish in age, they sounded different. They sounded much more like my grandparents, which my brothers and I had always joked and, don't, grandpa and grandma sound, so funny. The folks in line, my grandparents though, it was different from my brothers and I, who grew up in Erie, my cousins, my friends, even my father, who was a native Erieite. So I thought, there has to be something to this. So it was a rainy Saturday. I went home, and what better than eat custard Danish and start poking around on the internet. So I stumble upon this scholarly paper, and it talks about how Erie's unique because it flipped its dialect in the 20th century, and this needs to be studied more. And I thought, my God, I'm not crazy after all. But when I reached out or got back on the internet last year, because I thought this would be an interesting subject, and lo and behold, someone writes a PhD dissertation on it. So I reached out to Keelan, and he said it was that particular piece that I saw on the internet a decade prior, or 15 years prior, whenever I had seen it, that was written by his PhD advisor. And that's what inspired him to study the topic. So you talk about a small world and the 2 degrees of separation of all things Erie. But that's what sort of brought us together this evening. So you're going to hear about language, linguistics, a little bit of history. So please join me in a welcome for our speaker, Keelan.
Thank you very much, Cal, for that warm introduction. I'd like to thank the Jefferson Society for hosting this event. I'd also like to thank the Hagen History Center for sponsoring it, and to Mark Becker for sponsoring this event, this lecture series in honor of his mother, Doris Becker. Here's a little bit of a reverb. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank all of the informants that worked together with me in my PhD studies to help me understand the Erie accent and the Erie dialect a little bit better. Okay, so let me just give you a brief introduction to myself and my professional background, one of my qualifications for talking about this. Well, if you do an internet search for me, this is probably what you'll see. This is a picture that was taken of me in 2001. I was in a bicycle race. I was one of the few unicyclists in the race, and it was up a mountain in California of a 3,200-foot climb in elevation, over 10 miles. And I love this picture because I had just passed that bicyclist crossing this hairpin curve. And you can see the smile on my face, seeing how proud I was to be not close to the front of the pack, but at least I had this one bicyclist. Anyway, so unfortunately that's not what I do as my profession. My profession is a little bit more boring than that. My whole life I've been interested in languages, learning languages, studying languages, linguistics. So that's kind of driven what I've pursued professionally. My undergraduate degree in 2002 was in linguistics and classical languages from University of California, Berkeley, as Tom mentioned. Subsequently after that, I went on to teach English abroad for 2 years. 1 year in Japan and 1 year in Mexico. Then after that, 2004 to 2009 is when I did the research that informed my knowledge about this topic. At the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, I studied under the Honorable William Labov, who is basically the founder of sociolinguistics and was a leading figure in the field until he passed away, unfortunately, last year at the age of 97. My thesis was called The Permeability of Dialect Boundaries, a case study of the region surrounding Erie, Pennsylvania. And that's what I'll be talking about today. For the past 16 years, I've been away from that work. I've been working in the R&D area of artificial intelligence and natural language processing. I've had positions at 3 different companies, Educational Testing Service, a startup called Casisto in New York City, and currently I'm at the National Board of Medical Examiners. So for the past 16 years, I've been a little bit away from researching the Erie dialect and accent. There may have been some big changes in the past 16 years that I won't be talking about in this talk, but I did work on it in detail for those 5 years during my graduate career. Okay, so let's start about thinking a little bit about language and how it varies. So think about if you had this delicious looking sandwich for lunch today, and you paired it with this delicious looking beverage. Now, if someone asked you what you had for lunch today, what would you say? Now, depending on where you live in the country, your answer will likely be rather different. So, some people might say, I had a sub and a can of soda. And that might be kind of the generic, most expected default answer across the United States. But what if you're in Erie? What if you were born and raised in Erie? Any different answers here? Yeah, I had a sub and a can of pop. Some people, I heard hoagie, that's great. That's coming up in a second. But pop is a very common way of referring to this beverage here in Erie. If you're from Philadelphia, you would likely say, I had a hoagie and a can of soda. Hoagie is the most common way of referring to the sandwich in Philadelphia. If you were in Memphis, I had a sub and a can of Coke. Coke is the generic word for a beverage like this. Even if it's Pepsi brand, it's called Coke, with a lowercase c, notice, not an uppercase c. So this is just showing you how language can differ by dialect, by region across the country. And I could have given you many other examples. There's hero, there's grinder, there's po' boy, various different things like that. So this can be studied quantitatively, and that's what I did for my dissertation. So if you look into this in a little bit more detail, here on the left you see a map of the United States that tracks how people refer to that carbonated beverage. This was an internet survey that had over 100,000 respondents, so it's a pretty large-scale survey. The key here is in the lower right-hand corner. Pop is yellow, soda is light blue, Coke is purple, and then there are intermediate colors for some variation. So you can see here we are, Erie, very solid inside the pop area. It's bright yellow here, so most people here would be expected to say pop. If you go in New England, the mid-Atlantic states, also out west, more likely people would say soda. And looking in the south, more likely people would say Coke. Obviously there's some variation, but you can survey a large number of people and see general regional tendencies like this. Similarly, here on the right, this map shows a survey about this sandwich. The red dot shows you sub. It's quite common throughout basically the entire country. You can see here this green area, starting in Philadelphia, coming out towards western Pennsylvania, and maybe up towards Erie a little bit, for hoagie. I lived in Philadelphia for 5 years, and I still call it a hoagie, and some people from other parts of the country have no idea what I'm talking about when I said I had a hoagie for lunch. Here, this blue area shows you some of the hero, and then there's grinder. Anyway, I'm not going to be talking about these terms today necessarily, but this is just to give you a sense of how language can vary across geographical space. Now, a question you might ask, Cal, why did a history museum sponsor a lecture about regional dialects? Well, the professor will tell you, language is constantly changing. And throughout my graduate career in the University of Pennsylvania, I tried to study language change. The way I studied language change was by looking at variation across different geographic areas and trying to understand how it got to that point and where it was going from that point. So what drives this language variation and change? At the core, it's driven by different communication practices. Language is a social tool. People talk to each other to exchange ideas, to pass the time, to form social bonds and ties. When they are doing that, they are exposed to other ways of speaking, and they might modify the way they speak because of who they're speaking to. All of those millions and billions of communication events lead to changes in language over time. Now, these different communication patterns are obviously heavily shaped by historical events in the world. Settlement history, migration patterns, neighborhood dynamics, a lot of socio-cultural and historical factors that help influence language change. There's obviously cognitive factors, there's obviously psychological factors as well, but a lot of it is related to history. And that's what I'm going to be talking about to some extent today. Okay, so to understand this talk, you have to understand two main dialect regions in North America and the United States specifically, the North and the Midland. Now, north you can understand, that's in the north, right? That makes a lot of sense. Midland you might never heard of, might have never heard of if you aren't familiar with the linguistics literature, but it is a very well-established dialect region, and it's the common term that linguists refer to it. It's basically the region starting from west of Philadelphia, maybe including western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, and spreading out through Columbus, through southern Indiana, southern Illinois, and St. Louis. It's basically the area between the north and the south, and linguists have confirmed that it is a coherent dialect region that is distinct from these other regions. So I'm going to basically be talking about differences between the north and the Midland today. Now, why is the Erie dialect special? Why did I start doing research into it? Well, in the early to mid 20th century, there were several linguistic atlases, dialect geography studies, that tried to map what the speech patterns in North America looked like. It was a big effort that started around the Great Depression and continued after that. All of these early dialect geography studies showed that the speakers that they interviewed for those studies patterned with the North. Almost all of their pronunciation, lexical grammar patterns were the same as other speakers who lived in the North. Similar to Buffalo and Cleveland and other cities like that. However, studies that were conducted in the late 20th century, in particular the one that Cal referred to that was done by my PhD advisor, as well as a few other studies that documented the Erie dialect specifically, showed that it was solidly part of the Midland. It shared features more with Pittsburgh and Columbus. Not all features. I'm not saying that the Erie dialect is exactly the same as Pittsburgh and Columbus, but structural features that were important for dialect classification were shared with those cities. And it's the only city that has been documented to switch from the northern region to the Midland. So that kind of posed a question, and this quote here is, I think, what Cal saw, and it's what piqued my interest when I started graduate school. This is from the Atlas of North American English. This was a very large-scale study of North American English that was led by my PhD advisor, William LeBove, at the University of Pennsylvania. What they did was a telephone survey of the entire country. Every city with 50,000 or more residents was targeted, and 2 informants from that city at least were interviewed. So it's a very broad survey of North American English pronunciation. Each dot in this map represents an informant who was interviewed over the telephone, randomly selected from the phone book, and then recorded, and their pronunciation patterns were analyzed. You don't have to understand everything in this key right here, but the main thing to look at is you can see Rochester, Buffalo, Syracuse, Cleveland, Detroit, Toledo, Chicago. All of these cities that are part of the North, those speakers are listed in brown here. And that means they had a certain set of pronunciation patterns that were characteristic of those cities. And you can see there are these kind of circles drawn around these areas. Those are called isoglosses. Those are characteristic patterns that speakers that are within an isogloss would typically share. Now, here's the anomaly. Erie, 2 yellow dots. It doesn't belong to either of those 2 areas, and it makes a discontinuity here, basically. So coming along Lake Erie, those isoglosses break. Now, getting into the history a little bit, this is due to settlement patterns. Settlement came out from New England, upstate New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, the early settlers to this area, and then in the 19th century with the Erie Canal coming over and spreading through the Great Lakes, that communication network tended to lead to similar linguistic patterns. And so based on all of that, you would expect Erie to be part of that, but it isn't. So my advisor said in this book, the shift of Erie from north to Midland would seem to reflect an expansion of the regional influence of Pittsburgh. Why Erie has become linguistically aligned with Pittsburgh rather than Buffalo and Cleveland, the large northern cities to its east and west, remains an intriguing study for linguistic and historical research. Well, I saw that quote in an early draft of this atlas. It was published in 2006, but I had access to it when I started in graduate school in 2004. And I thought, okay, there's my dissertation topic, right? This is an unanswered question, and I have lots of family in Erie that can help me out with my field work, which they did, thankfully. So that's what I ended up doing, and I will share some of those results with you today. So here's a brief outline of the topics I'm going to cover and what I'd like to share with you about the research. So I mentioned that the early evidence showed that Erie was a northern city. I'll briefly review that so you can understand what the early dialect geography study showed and why people thought Erie was part of the north. Then I'm going to present some of the results of my dissertation research, documenting the current linguistic study of Erie and some of the neighboring towns around it. I don't have time to present all my dissertation research. This is a 50-minute lecture, Cal told me, so I'll try to stick to that. I'm going to focus primarily on one particular pronunciation pattern, the merger of cot and caught, C-O-T and C-A-U-G-H-T, represented by this symbol, short O, and O-H from a linguistic standpoint. I'll get into that in a lot more detail in a few minutes. But I'll give you an in-depth view of that particular change and how that characterizes the status of Erie. And then at the end, I'm going to present some evidence from Erie settlement history that hopes to provide a potential explanation for the linguistic trajectory and why Erie is a little bit different from some of the northern cities. Okay, so let's dive right into it. What is the early evidence that we have for the status of Erie from a dialect geography standpoint? As I mentioned a little bit ago, around the Great Depression, specifically in 1931, there was an initiative to start mapping the country. They started out with the Linguistic Atlas of New England. The fieldwork for that was conducted between 1931 and 1933. Went pretty quickly. They had about 450 informants for that. They moved on to Linguistic Atlas of Middle and South Atlantic States. That started in 1933. That one didn't go as quickly. Fieldwork for that continued until 1975. Took a little bit longer. That one had, I think, around 700 informants. There are many others in this series as well, these linguistic atlases. Those are the two primary ones that give us evidence for the northern region and the Midland region. Additionally, there was an effort called the Dictionary of American Regional English. Fieldwork for that was conducted between 1965 and 1970. That interviewed speakers from around the entire country. The speakers that are specifically from Erie County that were in those surveys are these 5 right here. So you might think, well, that's kind of a small number, and it is. They didn't have very that many resources back then. They couldn't do a large-scale internet survey. It was very labor-intensive to find each of these informants. So the LAMSAS, Linguistic Atlas of Middle and South Atlantic States, interviewed 2 speakers from Erie County, from the townships of Venango and Amity, which are relatively small farming townships in the southeastern part of Erie County, close to the border with New York State. Dictionary of American Regional English interviewed 3 informants from Erie County, 1 from Union City, also kind of in the southeast part of the county, and 2 from Northeast, obviously in the northeast part of the county. The birth years of these informants ranged from 1864, the oldest one, up to 1908. So this gives us a look into the status of the dialect pattern in Erie in the late 19th century, very early 20th century. So what do we see? I'm going to show you several maps here, and I'll walk through them a little bit so you can understand what you're looking at. This map here on the left is for the term that you would refer to. Usually how they did this, they described the item or they showed a picture of the item and they said, what do you call this thing? They didn't want to prime them with any of the words for it. So they might have shown a picture of a pail or a bucket, or they might have asked, what do you put water in when you're feeding a pig or something? And the informant would say, oh, that's a pail, or oh, that's a bucket, or that's something else. The main answers get put on this map here. Pail is a little triangle, bucket is a little circle. You can see the New England and North area have these big triangles. That shows that almost everybody in those regions said pail. There were a few circles over here around the Atlantic coast that said bucket.
In this area stretching from Philadelphia out to the west and the Midland, there's almost all circles. So almost all of those informants said bucket. Now what we're most interested in is Erie, obviously. You can see those two informants said pale. So that patterned with all of the speakers from the north area. That is basically the common theme we see in most of these maps from this study. Here's another one that shows you basically the same thing. Here's a word, what do you call a frying pan? And there were two dialect words for that, skillet or spider or creeper also. I'm not familiar with those, but apparently back in the turn of the 19th century, the two informants from Erie called it a spider. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with that term anymore. That term possibly has gone out of usage, but again, you can see that in the north, almost all the informants said spider, and in the Midland, almost all the informants said skillet. Okay, so based on these maps that show you the words or terms that specific informants provide, the researchers can draw these, as I refer to them, isoglosses. These are lines that if you're on one side of it, you'll probably say it one way. If you're on the other side, you'll probably say the other way. So here are isoglosses for whiffle tree or swingle tree, pale bucket, or darning needle or dragonfly. All of them, you can see that Erie is on the northern side. Similarly over here, you can see spider, frying pan, which we looked at, teeter or teeterboard versus seesaw, scaffold versus scaffold, and buttery versus pantry. All of them, Erie is on the northern side. Conversely, you can look at some isoglosses that are very characteristic of the Midland region. I want off instead of I want to get off. Sook, a call to cows. Snake feeder instead of darning needle. Blinds instead of roller shades. Ball, which is what a calf would say. For all of these, the Erie informants were on the north side and did not pattern with the Midland speakers. Now these terms might seem a little arcane or dated to you. Well, this is a history presentation, so I hope you're interested in that. But these were kind of the pop versus soda or hoagie versus sub back in the turn of the 20th century. Okay, and here are some more. String beans, snap peas, corn husks, corn shucks, stooped porch, Dutch cheese, smear cays, Winnie knicker, roller shades, blinds, paper bag poke, maple tree, sugar tree, cornbread, corn pone, skunk polecat. And there were a few others that I didn't list. The northern form is on one side, the Midland form is on the other side, and in 88% of these from the Linguistic Atlas of Middle and South Atlantic states, the Erie speakers patterned with the north from those, 29 out of 33. So that's pretty overwhelming evidence that those speakers patterned with the north. Very similar evidence comes from the Dictionary of American Regional English, a completely separate independent study. I'm not going to go into these details as much, but just you can see here's the isogloss for the north layer, and Erie is within that. Here's the isogloss for the Midland layer, and Erie is outside of that, sharing only 1 out of 40 of the isoglosses with other Midland speakers. So pretty convincing, pretty overwhelming evidence that Erie was, or at least those speakers that were interviewed from Erie, did pattern with northern speakers. So far I've talked about vocabulary, lexical items. Phonology, or pronunciation, is also a very important part of this. And the evidence from that aspect is also as overwhelmingly clear. Again, I won't go through all of these. There's a long list. These are all the Erie features that the speakers from Lamsass shared with the north. A couple examples, pronouncing dews and tube with a y sound instead of saying doos and twos. The vowel in for and farty were distinct instead of the same. Saying want instead of won't. Saying drouth instead of druth, and a whole bunch of these. Without instead of without, greasy instead of greasy, So these are all the ones that were in the Midland, and these are the ones that were in Erie and the rest of the northern cities. And there were only 3 Erie features that were shared with the Midland. So again, pretty overwhelming evidence of a pattern that the speakers from Erie were similar to the north and not to the Midland. Most importantly, the 2 Erie speakers pronounce the vowel in cot, C-O-T, differently from the vowel in caught, C-A-U-G-H-T. And that is going to be very important for the rest of my talk. So let me just show you a map of that. This is a map of all the speakers in LAMSAS, Linguistic Atlas of Middle and South Atlantic States. If the speakers pronounce those 2 words the same, they are shown in a blue square. If they pronounce them in red, if they pronounce them differently, they're shown in a red square. So here you see that boundary based on these speakers just runs a little bit south of Erie, where north of that, they would pronounce those 2 words differently. South of that, they would pronounce them the same. Okay, that was the early dialect geography research that was done in the early to mid 20th century. So my dissertation research was done between the years 2006 and 2008. So as I mentioned, it's a little bit old. There might have been some major changes that happened since then, which I would love to get back out in the field and study. I collected data from 106 speakers in the area around Erie, ranging from Pittsburgh up to Buffalo, but focusing around Erie County, Pennsylvania. I analyzed linguistic patterns over time. The informants in my data set range from being born in 1887 up to 2000. I had an emphasis on trying to find older speakers to try to go back as far as I could in time. So you'll see a lot of the data that I collected is from speakers born in the early 20th century. I looked at a lot of things in my dissertation. I looked at lexicon, I looked at morphosyntax, I looked at phonology, so words, grammar, pronunciation. Let me give you just a few examples of some of these things. So pop and soda we talked about already. Here's an interesting quote from Pam R., who was born in 1945 in Erie. And let's see if this audio works.
We say pop here, but everybody else says soda. So to me, a soda is ice cream with pop in it. And you drink it with a straw and eat it with a spoon.
Okay, so that shows you what she thought pop and soda meant to her. Another lexicon-related thing is the word "red up," meaning to clean up.
But I picked up Pittsburgh words from my mother, like redding up the house. Yeah. See, I've always said that. People don't know what I say when I say it, but I say it because my mother said it. She says it because her mother said it, and the Pittsburgh relatives say it. And I don't know why.
So this is an interesting quote. Pam R. was born in Erie in 1945, but her mother was from Pittsburgh, so she explicitly shows how there was a connection with Pittsburgh here. And I should point out that I'm using pseudonyms for all the speakers in my dissertation research, so these are not the real names of the speakers. I looked at morphosyntax and grammar. One feature that is very common in Pittsburgh and other areas of the Midland, which has spread up to Erie, is saying things like the car needs washed, the dog needs fed. I unfortunately don't have an audio file of that to share with you, but I did study that. Another one I looked at is positive anymore. So the word anymore across the United States is used in a negative polarity context, so something like, people don't do this anymore. That's very common. But in some areas of the Midland and some speakers in Erie, it's used in a positive context. So here's an example of that from Jason Kay, who was born in 1935 in Pittsburgh.
Down in Texas and all, they're getting all kind of snow anymore in the winters.
So that just means basically nowadays. There's no negative context there. It's just saying these days. And here's another example of that one from a speaker who was born in 1953 in Erie.
Since 9/11, of course, that's the world's excuse to do anything anymore.
Again, a positive context, not a negative context. And then I looked at phonology pronunciation, and this is actually what I focused on the most in my dissertation. I recorded all of these speakers, at least 30 minutes of their speech. I analyzed all of their vowel pronunciations acoustically using computational processing methodology, and I produced very detailed charts of how all their pronunciations related to each other. The one, and I could spend hours talking about that, the one I'm going to focus on, in the interest of time, and because it's the most important, is cot versus caught. I've already given a little teaser about that. But let's listen to John M., who was born in Ripley, just over the border in Chautauqua County, New York. Whoops, that didn't work. Try that again.
Sound the same, cot. Actually, they're different. Cot, caught, cot, caught.
Okay, so he pronounces them differently. He wasn't sure about it at first, but when he thought about it, he clearly did. And here we have Flora R., who was born in 1919 in Erie.
Caught and caught. They sound the same to me.
Okay, and to me as well. Here's a map of all of the speakers that I recorded and studied for my dissertation. So as I mentioned, I looked all the way down to Pittsburgh, and I went all the way up to Buffalo, focusing on the city of Erie and the neighboring towns in Erie County and across the border in Chautauqua County, New York State. In total, 106 speakers. Why did I focus on the merger of cot and caught? Why is this important for tracking Erie's linguistic history? Well, we've talked a lot about things like hoagie and sub and pop and soda. When it comes down to it, actually pronunciation patterns are a lot more important for defining a dialect region's linguistic history and linguistic coherence and structure than lexical and grammatical patterns. Lexical and grammatical patterns don't cohere together as tightly. As I showed you with the maps of pop and soda and Coke, those didn't really correspond to any really known dialect boundaries. Same with sub and hoagie, but the pronunciation patterns typically do all pattern together and are very well defined. And specifically, the cot-caught merger is the single most important sound change that impacts regional dialects in North America. Based on whether a speaker has the cot-caught merger or not, will determine many other aspects of how they pronounce other vowels in the English language. So it is very important to know the status of that particular change. So I said the vowel in cot, sometimes called short O, and the vowel in caught, sometimes called long OH, represent two different phonemes. That means these are two different sounds in the speaker's cognitive representation of how language is pronounced. However, some speakers have merged them into one single phoneme. If you pronounce these differently, these pairs are all pronounced differently, what are called minimal pairs, where they differ by only one sound. Cot, caught, don, don, bot, bot, pond, pond, poly, poly, not, tot, tot, walk, walk, chalk, chalk, nod, nod, etc., etc., etc. There are a whole lot of these. It's a very, very productive difference in the pronunciation of North American English. There are also many other words that are pronounced with the cot vowel, sock, stop, hot, pod. Many other words that are pronounced with the caught vowel, law, draw, thought, etc. The most interesting thing, speakers are usually not aware of the status of these two vowels in their own pronunciation. They don't really think about it that much. It goes below the level of consciousness. And that makes it really perfect for studying from a quantitative standpoint. Okay, so here's a map that was collected as part of the Atlas of North American English, just to give you a sense of what the cot-caught merger looks like over the entire country. In this map, the blue dots are speakers who have a difference. The red dots are speakers who have a merger. So basically, any red dot is where the speakers would say cot and caught the same, and blue is where they would say them differently. Here we can see Erie, Pennsylvania. It has a red dot. So this is a more recent speaker than what we saw the evidence for from Lamsas. Now you might ask, how do we know if a speaker has the merger or if they pronounce them distinct? Well, like that speaker I showed you, we could ask them, but they might be confused, right? He was like, well, they're the same. Well, actually, they're different. So typically, linguists look at two different sources of evidence. One is perception, and that's exactly what I showed for that speaker. You basically ask them, pronounce these two words, do they sound the same or different to you? That's on their own perception. Then you can look at production. So you actually record them saying the words, you take their speech, you analyze it acoustically using speech processing software, and then you can get measurements to see how close they are. So here in this figure, it's showing you what's called the waveform representation of the speech. Here we have the words aw, which has the OH vowel, and not, which has the O vowel. So this is the waveform, this is a spectrogram, and this is just the transcription of the words and the phonemes. In the spectrogram, you can see these red lines. I'm not going to go into how they are calculated, but these red lines are called formants, and the two lower red lines are called the first and second formant. If you look at aw, you can see these two formants are very close together, and if you look at not, you can see these two formants are substantially further apart. Basically, taking these formant measurements is a way of quantitatively saying at a large scale for any given speaker if they pronounce these two vowels the same or different. And you can use some complex statistical methodology to have a pretty accurate judgment about whether they're the same or different. So for my dissertation, I used a combination of both of these two techniques, perception and production. Okay, so let's get into it. When did the cot-caught merger happen in Erie? Well, the evidence I showed you at the beginning was the Lamsass informants who were born in 1864 and 1903 who don't have the merger. Then I also showed you evidence from that map with the two yellow dots and the brown dots around it. These were informants for the Atlas of North American English who were born in 1956 and 1964 who do have the merger. Then I haven't mentioned yet, there was another study conducted in 1990, a telephone survey of speakers in Pennsylvania to track the spread of the merger. There was one informant from Erie who was born in 1925 who did have the merger. Okay, so this evidence on the face of it suggests that the merger occurred in Erie around the first 2 decades of the 20th century, so maybe sometime between 1900 and 1925. Okay, so at the early stages of my dissertation research, I tried to focus on collecting data from Erieites who were born around this time. So remember, I was conducting this research between 2006 and 2008. There actually were some living Erieites who were born in the first 2 decades of the 20th century at that time. One way I tried to access speakers from this age range was I approached a retirement community. I placed an advertisement there describing the study I was looking to do, and said that I wanted to interview native-born Erie'ites who are living at the retirement community about their language patterns. And I got 12 subjects, 9 of them from the city of Erie, 1 from Oil City, 1 from Pittsburgh, and 1 from Buffalo. Their birth years ranged from 1912, that was the oldest, Dan R., up through 1941, Dana W. Okay, so let me just show you how I analyzed their speech. And this graph here on the right is going to give you a good way of interpreting several of the graphs that I have coming up. So this is Walter Kay. He was born 1927 in Buffalo. This is an example of a speaker who we expect to have them distinct, right? We don't expect any merger of cot and caught in Buffalo. And as we see here, we don't. So how do we interpret this? Well, first let's listen to Walter.
Cot, caught. Different sound, different meaning. Cot, caught.
Clearly has a distinction there in perception. He thinks they're different. And here is Don and Dawn.
Don, Dawn. Boy, girl.
Okay. So definitely different in perception. So in production, I spent a lot of my time doing acoustic analyses, and this is the graph that was produced for his vowels, short O, which are these little purple squares, and long OH, which are these little pink triangles. So each of these purple squares or pink triangles represent one pronunciation of a word, either from a word list that the speakers read or the 30-minute interview that I recorded with them. So I went through all of the interviews, found every word that comes from either the cot category or the caught category, and then measured each one of those. And here, this two-dimensional plot shows you the first two formant measurements. You don't have to understand how that's produced necessarily, but the main takeaway is you have a cloud of little purple boxes. This represents the COT, cot, phoneme. And you have a cloud of little pink triangles that represents the CAUGHT, caught phoneme. There is a pretty clear boundary between them. There's one token of talk that was over here inside the purple cloud, but basically it's a complete distinction between all of the words from those two categories. This is a canonical case of someone who has a distinction, who doesn't have a merger. You can do some quantitative measurements. You can look at the Euclidean distance between the means of these vowels. The distance there is 436. That's a quite large number, as you'll see. Because right now we'll compare Walter K. with Dan R. This was the oldest subject from this retirement community who was born in Erie, born in 1912. Let's listen to Dan.
Caught and caught.
And do they sound the same or different?
They do.
A little hard to hear, it was quieter. I asked, do they sound the same or different? And he said they do sound the same.
They sound the same.
Okay, one more time.
Dawn, dawn.
Okay, so this was the oldest Erie resident at this retirement community, and in perception, he claimed that these phonemes were exactly the same for him. And if you look at the evidence from production, you can see the mean vowels measurements are very close to each other, and the two clouds almost completely overlap. This is a very canonical distribution for a speaker who has a complete merger. There's no way to distinguish these two categories. It's basically just one. And you can see the distance here is 55. It's very close, much different from Walter's, which was 436. Okay, so this was maybe a little disappointing to me. I had hoped to find a living Erieite who had the distinction, who didn't have the merger. I was hoping to find someone who would basically make a bridge back to the Lamsass speakers who had a distinction. But I didn't. Dan R. was the oldest, and all of the other Erieites from this retirement community had a clear merger in perception and production. So that was maybe a little disappointing, but that's how research goes. So I tried to push the boundary back a little bit further. How can I find some speakers who were born before this? Right? So this is all the information that we looked at earlier. Now we can add this Erie retirement community that had residents born as early as 1912. This suggests maybe the merger occurred in Erie during the first decade of the 20th century. Can we find someone born during that time? Would they provide us with this evidence? I found a very relevant archival collection at the Hagen History Center called the Seasonal Workers in Viticulture Archive. These were oral history interviews that were conducted in 1988, and the goal was to document the local grape growing industry around the town of Northeast Pennsylvania. And they were audio cassette tapes at the Hagen History Center, which was then called the Erie County Historical Society, and they were publicly accessible. I went there, I digitized them, and I made vowel measurements of the two oldest speakers in that archive. They were born in 1906 and 1907. I selected those because they were the most likely to preserve the distinction between cot and caught, being the two oldest speakers in that archive. Well, let's listen to Richard O. So obviously I didn't collect this data. I just have to deal with whatever words were spoken in it. I couldn't control it. So I didn't have a perception test. I couldn't ask Richard O, do these sound the same to you? Here's an example of his speech talking about grape cultivation.
Grapes was managed different. It was worked more thorough, and the weeds kept down by working instead of herbicide.
It's a little hard to hear. The audio quality was a little poor for this, but he said the weeds were kept down by working instead of herbicide. Anyway, I went through that entire interview with Richard O. It was quite long. It was an hour and a half long, and found all of the words that had these two vowels in them. What does his pattern look like? It's a little bit hard to interpret, right? It's a little bit ambiguous. Doesn't look like Walter K's or Dan R's. We do see a distance between the mean values of 201, and we do see a fair number of little purple squares here with no overlap, and a fair number of little pink triangles here with no overlap, but there is a certain amount of overlap in the middle. So it's a little hard to say whether this speaker had a merger or distinction, and linguists would typically label someone like this as transitional. It's not a clear distinction, but it's not a clear merger either. So it looks like this is around the time when the merger was happening. We see kind of similar evidence from Benjamin S., who was born in 1907, and let's listen to him.
They came out and they said, "Can we spend 2 weeks in the old farmhouse?" Right on the bank of the lake, and a real nice spot. And we Uncle Fritz is sure, and Dad's is sure. That 2 weeks turned out to be 35 years.
So I listened to these interviews. I just picked out parts that I thought were kind of interesting and funny. Anyway, if you look at Benjamin S.'s vowels, well, they are pretty close. The distance between them is only 68, but there are a bunch of little pink triangles that don't overlap. So again, the speaker is kind of transitional. It's a little hard to classify as merged or distinct without actually being able to interview Benjamin S. and hear the minimal pairs. Okay, so what does this evidence tell us? Well, the two oldest speakers in this archive, born in 1906 and 07, I would say have at least a partial merger. It's hard to tell for sure, but they don't have a completely clear distinction, and they're moving in the direction of merger, of caught and caught. Can we find any older evidence? Well, I was lucky enough to come across a video recording of an Erieite named H.O. Hurt, who was one of the two founders of the Erie Insurance Exchange. He was born in 1887, so pushing back by 2 decades from the other evidence that we had. This was a video that was recorded in 1977 when he was 90 years old. And it was kind of reflecting on his time back as the chairman of, or the CEO of the Erie Insurance Exchange, right after he had stepped down from that position. So let's listen to H.O. Hurt for a minute.
Super Standard Insurance, we adopted as our advertising slogan. The Erie is above all in service. And if you'll examine the word service, you'll find that the letters E-R-I-E occur in that word, in that order. So that we adopted very early. So our advertising slogan that the Erie was above all in service. And that's been our advertising slogan and our ideal in all the years since then.
So I believe they came up with that slogan in 1925 when Erie Insurance Exchange, or Erie Insurance Company, was founded. They're just having their 100-year anniversary now, and they still use that tagline and that slogan. It's a little free advertising for Erie Insurance. But that was a fascinating video, and it was really great to have access to a speaker who was born in the 19th century. So what do his vowel pronunciations look like? Well, again, I measured every single word that had caught and caught phonemes in them. And again, we see a somewhat ambiguous picture. There is a fair amount of overlap. It doesn't look like Walter K's with a clear distinction, but we do see a cluster of the purple squares over here and a cluster of the pink triangles. And the distance is 250. So it's not as close as someone who has a complete merger. So again, I would characterize this as someone who is in the process of this merger, going through the transition.
Super standard.
Okay. So again, I would say that H.O. Hurt had at least a partial merger of these two phonemes. Okay, so at this point, I was kind of throwing up my hands trying to understand this data. How do we make sense of this, right? Because we had the Lamsass speakers who were born as late as the first decade of the 20th century, showing a clear distinction. Whereas H.O. Hurt pushes back 2 decades before that, who has a merger. And we know from linguistic science and other studies that you can't undo a merger. Once a population has merged 2 phonemes, they're not going to undo it. So how does this work out from a chronological and historical and dialect geography standpoint? Well, one way to think about it is to think about who were these specific people who were being interviewed. We obviously can't characterize an entire city, an entire county, homogenously. It's made up of individual speakers who all have different linguistic trajectories. So the Lamsass informants that we looked at from Venango and Amity townships, who did not have the merger, were from small farming communities in southeastern Erie County. Now, H.O. Hurt, who we just listened to, and the retirement community residents are all from the city of Erie itself. So both in Erie County, obviously, but very different profiles of communities that they live in. Now, if we think about how the merger can spread through space and time, one model that we could look at is the merger likely started in the city of Erie before 1900, because we saw that H.O. Hurt was in transition in 1887 when he was born, and then spread gradually throughout Erie County based on the density of communication patterns. As I referred to early on in my talk, language changes because of how people talk to each other. Communication is different between different people in different areas of the county and the country, obviously. And back around the turn of the 20th century, it was obviously influenced by things like the roads that were there, the business patterns, economics, and everything else like that. So it could have spread more quickly to Northeast, where we saw the seasonal workers and viticulture speakers having a transitional merger, than to the smaller towns where the Lamsass informants lived. And you can see, well, there's a major highway that passes between Northeast and Erie. Other economic factors lead us to believe that Northeast and Erie probably had more people moving back and forth than the small farming townships in southeastern Erie County. This general pattern that I'm kind of describing to you is known in dialect geography as the cascade model of linguistic change. My advisor, William LeBove, coined this term and had a publication about it in 2003. Basically what it means is linguistic change tends to spread out from more populous areas to other more populous townships that are in the region, and then to smaller ones. So kind of cascading from large to somewhat larger, and then all the way down to the small ones. And that basically is just a reflection of how communication works, because the larger towns and cities have people going between them more frequently than to the smaller towns and more rural communities. Okay, that's all for the linguistics portion of the talk, and I know that it was kind of in-depth and in the weeds. I hope that you're still interested. I'm going to wrap up now with just a couple slides specifically about settlement history and about migration patterns. So I'm not an expert in this area by any means. I'm an expert in phonetics and linguistic science. But while trying to answer some of the questions that I posed here about the trajectory of the linguistic patterns in Erie, I did do a little research into some primary sources to understand who lived in Erie at the beginning, where they came from, what they might have sounded like, and how that might have resulted in what I observed in my studies. So this slide just gives you a very brief introduction into Erie settlement. I was at Hagen History Center today. They have a whole second floor exhibit about this. I'm sure there's probably something on this slide that is incorrect anyway. So you should go there if you want to learn more. Well, this is what I was able to learn. So the first recorded inhabitants were the Erie Indians. The Senecas defeated the Eries in 1654 and took over much of the land. British and French settlers established military forts, but no non-military settlements. Then the state of Pennsylvania acquired rights to the land here in Erie through a treaty with the Six Nations in 1784. And shortly after that is when the first American settlers started arriving in 1795. Erie was incorporated as a borough in 1805. And then after that, throughout the 19th century, there was rapid population growth. I mentioned the Erie Canal earlier. All of the commerce through the Great Lakes was a big driver of that. So you can see here the population of the city of Erie and the population of the county of Erie in this table by decade throughout the 19th century. Started out 81 residents in 1800, then goes up to 394, 635, 1,000, 3,000, 5,000, up to 40,000 by 1890 in the city of Erie. And the population of the county of Erie increases at a somewhat similar rate. Okay, where did these settlers come from? Well, the sources that I looked at for these numbers and for some other statistics generally said they primarily came from the north. So they would mention New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts. But I didn't see any hard numbers in there. I didn't see any quantitative data to really give me a good sense about, was that across the board? Was there some variation? So I tried to look into this question myself a little bit, and I conducted research into two specific primary sources. These were called the Revolutionary Patriots in Erie County, PA, and then biographies of over 1,000 important Erie residents from this Sanford source that I just cited. Revolutionary Patriots, those were very early settlers. The Sons of the American Revolution organization characterizes someone as a revolutionary patriot based on certain types of service that they provided, either being a soldier in the Revolutionary War, signing the Declaration of Independence, several other specific criteria. So there were a certain number of revolutionary patriots who resided in Erie County. None of them obviously were born in Erie County because of Erie wasn't settled by Americans at that point. So they all came from elsewhere. This graph here on the left shows you the geographical origin of all of the revolutionary patriots that were in this publication, based on state, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Maryland, or foreign country, Ireland. So you can see the largest group were from Connecticut, but then substantial groups from Pennsylvania, Ireland, and then a few other states. Sanford 1894, as I mentioned, had biographies of over 1,000 important Erie residents from the early to mid 19th century. And I went through all of those and found the geographic place of origin of each resident who was not born in Erie County. So that was around 600 or so that make up this graph. And over 250 of those were from New York. That was the largest single source. But again, a large contingent from Pennsylvania, and then smaller contingents from other places: Vermont, England, Ohio, Connecticut, Germany, Ireland, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. So what does this tell us? Well, my conclusion from this is that Erie was never fully northern in terms of the initial settlers, and also likely in terms of the initial linguistic patterns. So if we see the evidence from the Revolutionary Patriots, 57% of them were northern. Yes, that's the majority, but there was a solid minority who came from mid-Atlantic states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and also a decent chunk that came from Europe, 18%. So these were very early settlers, average birth year 1754, average death year 1833. The breakdown for the biographies of Erie residents was similar: 60% northern, 20% mid-Atlantic, and 13% Europe. So the slight majority were northern, but there was always a sizable contingent of non-northerners, including a large number of Scots-Irish. So I posited in my dissertation that this mixed initial settlement history likely explains Erie's receptiveness to non-northern linguistic features. So there were early residents coming up from Pennsylvania who might have been from Ireland originally or somewhere else that had very different speaking patterns than the northern settlers who were coming across from New York and Connecticut and other northern states. So the general pattern was probably northern, but there was a substantial substrate that was non-northern, which meant that the city was more receptive to this shift that we saw happening in the late 19th century and early to mid 20th century. So the speakers in these early dialect studies, Lamb, Sass, and Dare, were not necessarily representative of the county as a whole, in particular the more urban population, which is what led to the Cot-Cot merger and most likely led to several of the other changes that we observed in Erie. Okay, so that's basically everything I wanted to present today, and I'm going to leave you with this little tidbit. The Cot-Cot merger, as I said, is the most important single linguistic change that's happening in North America right now. I would have loved to stay researching it, but I got a job outside of academia and haven't been able to do that for the last 16 years. But one other thing I did as part of my dissertation, in addition to trying to push back the chronological tracing of the merger, I tried to find the geographical isogloss for it right now. So where is, or in 2006 to 2008, where was the boundary of the merger? So basically at that point and now, if you find anyone from Erie County, the city of Erie, anywhere else in Erie County, they will have the merger if they were born and raised here. They might have moved in from somewhere else and would have a distinction, but anyone from Erie County is going to have the merger. If you find someone who doesn't, please let me come and research them, because that will be a really great find. But what I tried to do is try to push out geographically and find where the current state of that boundary was. And I found a lot of very interesting evidence in Ripley. So not far from Erie, just across the border in Chautauqua County, I started doing some research there, and I did find a couple older speakers with a distinction. I played one of the sound clips from you. That was the speaker who at first wasn't sure about cot and caught, but then pronounced them clearly differently. That was a speaker who was born in, I think, the 40s, if I remember correctly. But then I interviewed some teenagers, some younger speakers, who all had a clear merger in Ripley. So that was pretty interesting evidence that the change was going on in progress in Ripley. Now, if you look at this map, you can see all these dots in Ripley. I spoke to a lot of people in Ripley. They're ordered by age. So the ones in the upper left are the oldest, and then by row they get younger. So lower right is the youngest, upper left is the oldest. Blue dots are ones that have a clear merger. They're the same in production and perception. Red dots are ones who have a clear distinction. So Buffalo is as expected, hasn't spread over to Jamestown yet, or Westfield even. But here for these older Ripleyites, we can see that some of them are different, but some of them are kind of close, like those Northeast speakers or like H.O. Hurt. They seem to be in transition. And then all of the younger speakers in Ripley were clearly merged. So when I did this research in 2006 to 2008, it looked like around maybe 30 years or so before that, the merger had gone to completion in Ripley. And I bet that anyone who has been born in Ripley in the past 15, 16 years since I was there would have the merger now. And what I would love to do is kind of push past Ripley a little bit, look at some of these neighboring towns, and see if any of the younger speakers there have the merger, and to try to see how is it spreading into the north. But it might not be. It might be a solid boundary as well. We'd have to do the research to see. So that can be the study for someone's next dissertation, and I encourage you to do that research and keep me informed about it. So thank you for your attention, and hope to have a nice discussion about this afterwards.
Well, and I think that there still have some cards, and I have a few to start with. But before we get into the cards and the audience questions, it's very clear some infiltration, if you will, or some evidence of the really Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania accent coming, changing. Any theories of why that might be the case?
Should I use this one? Yeah, great question. And I did try to look into that in my dissertation a little bit. Again, it comes down to communication patterns and kind of regional affiliation. There has been a lot of migration from Pittsburgh up to Erie throughout the 20th century. One of my informants even told me a term, MUPs. Maybe some of you have heard that, where they refer to Pittsburghers as MUPs because they come up for the summer and spend time in Erie. And so there is a lot of going back and forth like that. There isn't anything like that between Erie and Buffalo, say, for example. The relationship is much more separate. And also I tried to look at some things like media, television, radio stations, sports. Do residents of Erie, are they more likely to root for the Steelers or the Buffalo Bills or the Cleveland Browns? And for all of those things, there was a slight tendency to be more aligned with Pittsburgh than the other northern cities. I can't say that any of that is conclusive, but it is kind of reflective of more of an alignment throughout the 20th century with Pittsburgh. And Erie and Pittsburgh are in the same state, Pennsylvania, which does have a bearing on it as well.
Well, that's fascinating. I was able to confirm that with at least one statistic, or a rough statistic. Just recently, I'm a boater, and I had always heard that the majority of the boat owners in our marinas and things weren't from here, and asked a marina manager of a major marina who said approximately 2/3 of their boat owners are from the Pittsburgh region or thereabouts. So that would certainly track with your theory. Switching gears, someone asked a very interesting question that sort of relates to what you were talking about of your research of looking at the rural parts of Erie County versus the urban. And they were asking of why is it that in some of the rural communities in Erie County, it's almost as if you hear a southern drawl at times.
Yeah, well, I'd have to, people use the term drawl a lot. I'm not sure exactly what is meant by that because different people mean different things. There are some connections between the speech of Western Pennsylvania and some areas that are more in the South Midland. So there is the pronunciation of pin and pen, for example. In the South, those are merged as pen, just the same thing. In the Midland and North are typically different, but there are some areas where that is spreading up into the Midland area as well. It's going to have to come down to settlement and communication. So it's possible that in some of the more rural areas in Erie County, some of the settlers came from areas that had those speech patterns. I did not spend that much time in those parts of the county, so I can't speak to that from my own research, though.
So playing off of that, there's a couple of questions that have to do with influence. And what is more of a profound influence, someone's own parents, or is it the specific geographic area that they live in and those speech patterns that you mentioned coming in from other areas?
That's a fascinating question, and that's one that linguists have been trying to study a lot in the past couple decades. Most research shows that the strongest influence is the peers and is the region that you are born and raised in, not your family background. There are some cases where that's different, and it does come down a little bit to how the child gets integrated into the school community, or how isolated they are and what type of bond they have with their family. But in most cases, most studies have shown that obviously children start speaking like their parents if they're at home most of the time, which most people are before the age of 5 or 6. But when they start going to school, they end up speaking like their other peers in the community, especially if the community is very homogeneous and there is one common way of speaking. That can differ if you're in a community that is kind of like a melting pot linguistically and has a lot of people from different parts of the country or different countries even. In that case, there isn't a single norm that you gravitate towards. But generally, peer community trumps family in terms of language patterns.
That's fascinating. I would have thought it was the other way around.
Yep.
As I review some of the new cards that came in, I'm just curious. I read in a couple of different places that linguists love studying Pennsylvania, that if you had a choice of any state in the country, they would choose PA. Why?
Well, so you do have this boundary between the North and the Midland. That's a fascinating boundary in and of itself. You do have Pittsburgh, which is really crazy, with yins and downtown and a whole bunch of different strange things. And Philadelphia also has a really particular accent, way of pronouncing things. Also, Philadelphia is the single best researched city linguistically in the country. My advisor, William Lebove, had been a professor there since the 1960s. He led a graduate seminar every year, which would have graduate students, go out into the Philadelphia community and make recordings. In the linguistics laboratory was an archive starting with old reel-to-reel tapes and then recently digitized recordings. Thousands and thousands of Philadelphia residents have been interviewed and recorded and analyzed. It's something called the Philadelphia Neighborhood Corpus. So it's the most richly studied city linguistically in the entire country.
And one of the audience questions, because you'd mentioned Pittsburgh just now as well, they were asking specifically that unique Pittsburgh accent that we all call sort of Pittsburghese.
Yeah.
They're wanting to know if that's a Scots-Irish influence or where that comes from.
I didn't study Pittsburgh in that much depth, but everything I read leans toward that influence, yes, Scots-Irish. And other areas around Pittsburgh have some similarities. So Youngstown, Columbus share some of the things, maybe not as extreme as Pittsburgh does, but those areas all had pretty heavy Scots-Irish immigration coming up from the Appalachian area. So that is what linguists believe, yes.
So like, would it also be referred to maybe as an Appalachian accent, or?
A little bit different, but shares many characteristics.
Similarities.
Yep.
This is a forward-looking question from the audience. Do you have, now granted, it's been longer than a decade since you've been at the research, but do you have any predictions of the future of the Erie accent based on what you saw, of what way it might head?
Well, Erie is really interesting, and I didn't have time to go into all the aspects of the Erie accent. And we're talking about how it is similar to Pittsburgh and is part of the Midland. But the interesting thing about the Erie accent is that it's kind of defined negatively. Like, it doesn't participate in a lot of these weird things that Pittsburgh is doing that I just mentioned. It does have the merger of cot and cod. And it's not part of the North. A lot of what is part of the Erie accent is kind of a default, generic, and not marked kind of form, if you look at how the other regional variations are. And that's kind of interesting. How does that come about? That often comes about through mixing of different communities coming together, different accents coming together, and they coalesce on something that is kind of common ground. So where is it going in the future? I think it will depend on what the population trajectory of Erie County looks like, who's migrating into it, and how that will change who people speak to. The merger will not be undone, though. I can tell you that with 100% certainty.
So maybe a question to conclude, because you were asked this earlier this evening, and that was in the lead up to this is the one that I heard, the most people were rolling their eyes and saying, we don't have an accent in Erie, it's flat. Is there such a thing as the broadcaster accent? And does Erie represent that sort of ideal of a NBC News anchor's accent?
Well, to a certain extent, yes, because for major broadcast networks, they try to find accents that are unmarked, that are not really clearly identifiable as a particular strong regional accent, because the thinking is that that would maybe be distracting, or that it would show some regional partisanship or something like that. So there is a broad area in the Midland out towards the west that has the merger of cot and caught, doesn't have any of the strong vowel shifts that are going on, and is a somewhat less marked accent, and Erie is part of that. So from that standpoint, I would say that would make sense. Obviously, I haven't consulted with any of the networks. I don't know what they're thinking, but I think that pattern does exist, yes.
So the networks can all study how we talk here.
Maybe the next Tom Brokaw will come from Erie, yes.
Keelan, want to wish you a wonderful family reunion. Thank you so much for joining us in Erie. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Cal. It was a pleasure.